In a world where the Holocaust is so enormous and so obviously evil, we oftentimes forget that the Holocaust was the last plan in a stage of plans that the Nazis had to deal with what they thought of as Europe's Jewish problem. These included moving all of Europe's Jews to the Urals after the hypothetical defeat of Russia, and another one was to resettle Europe's Jews in southeastern Poland. One of the more outlandish plans was to settle Europe's Jews in Madagascar, off the coast of Africa. The idea was actually first developed by the Polish, not the German government before the start of the war, but the Poles saw no way of doing it and so gave the idea up. However, during the war, the Germans took up the idea and thought of one of the terms of the surrender of France would be to give up Madagascar to a Jewish state, because Madagascar was a French colony. But the thing is, with Britain controlling the oceans after the fall of France, there was no way the Germans could get the Jews to Madagascar, so the idea was postponed until Britain had fallen. But this never happened, and so the Madagascar Plan never happened. The only way to do this timeline and not have it turn into a what if the Germans won World War II timeline is to have the British and the Germans cooperate. In the middle of the bloodiest war in history, this is very unlikely. Perhaps the British are more anti-Semitic and want to get rid of Europe's Jews, or maybe the Germans threaten Britain with killing all of Europe's Jews and the British buckle. It doesn't matter, this scenario is meant to be fun and use your suspension of disbelief. The plan was to liquidate Jewish assets in Europe and use the money to fund a migration to Madagascar. 1 million Jews a year is supposed to be exported to Madagascar. We can assume the Jews would probably be transferred onto British ships in the Atlantic for the voyage to Madagascar. This would mean that by the end of the war, roughly 5 million Jews would be in Madagascar. In the later years of the war, the Germans would simply export their Jewish population to the British lines, and the British would export them to Madagascar by ship. So what if the Madagascar Plan happened? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. The Jewish state was originally supposed to secede from the German puppet Vichy France, who controlled it. The state was to be controlled by the SS, and so expect enormous amounts of brutality and death from mistreatment in the creation of the Jewish state. In our timeline, the Battle of Madagascar, or when the British tried to conquer Madagascar from Vichy France, was actually surprisingly bloody, and took 6 months for the British to win. The result would likely be the same in this timeline, with the small SS force used to oversee the construction of the Jewish state fighting harder than the Vichy French, but the Jewish population siding with the British as any alternative to the Germans. It would balance out. In the end, it would be the same result in a British victory, with the Germans being unable to reinforce their colony. For the rest of the war, it would be a British mandate, with a local Jewish population controlling things in the front, while in reality being a British puppet state. After the war, however, as the British would go into decline, Jewish Madagascar would become a fully independent nation, and likely a democracy like Israel in our timeline. After the war, so many Jews would be in Madagascar that a majority of the remaining Jews in Europe would likely migrate to Madagascar in order to escape the prejudice in their home nations and exist in a majority Jewish nation. Assuming Madagascar would have a population of around 8 million Jews, the Malagasys, or the native inhabitants of Madagascar, had a population of around 4 million at the end of the war. This would make Madagascar a majority Jewish nation. Would we see what would happen in our timeline's Israel, where the Palestinians and Jews fought a series of horrendous wars over control of the land? No, this is mainly because of the size of the land we're talking about. Madagascar may look small on the map, but it's actually slightly smaller than Texas or France. Meanwhile, Israel is roughly the size of New Jersey and far less fertile than Madagascar. Today, Madagascar has a population of 22 million. In simple terms, there's enough land for everyone. Jews would tend to cluster around the central mountains, where the climate is cooler and more conducive to Europeans, while the natives would tend to predominate in the rest of the country. We would see a very different Jewish culture develop in Madagascar in this timeline than did in Israel. In Israel, Jews from all over the world settled in a small area and assimilated to each other. This did not happen completely, with there being a division between Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews, but compared to Madagascar in this timeline, it would be nothing. Madagascar is simply so large that Jews from certain parts of the world would congregate in different parts of the island, maintaining their regional culture and breaking off in different directions. You would see Western and Central European, Eastern European, and Middle Eastern Jews all founding their own cultures in separate parts of the island. This is similar to America and New Zealand in our timeline. New Zealand's culture has far less regional variety than America because it's smaller, and so people from different parts of Britain had to adapt to each other. In America, meanwhile, people from different parts of Britain settled in different parts, thus keeping their regional variety, thus we get more cultural division in America today. Madagascar being a stable nation physically and ethnically removed from the continent of Africa would mean Madagascar would become the financial capital of Africa. Being geographically removed would mean that Madagascar would not get involved in local politics, and so people wouldn't really hate Madagascar. The Malagasys are of originally Indonesian descent, and are culturally independent from the rest of the continent of Africa, and so the losses of the Malagasys would not hurt relations with continental Africa. African dictators would put their embezzled money in Madagascar, flights to African cities would fly through Madagascar, etc. Being a stable nation in the region and dependent on local trade would force Madagascar to act out militarily. Madagascar would need to keep its trade routes safe, and thus would get involved in the politics of the region. They would likely militarily intervene in Somalia to prevent piracy hurting trade, or aid Kenya against Islamic terrorism. Madagascar would likely intervene militarily in favor of friendly regimes in the region and become a regional power in the western Indian Ocean. Meanwhile, in Europe, the movements of Europe's Jewish population to Madagascar would mean that we would not have had the Holocaust. A major side effect of this would be that the Germans would not be completely changed from World War II. The Holocaust was so undeniably evil that it could be held over Germany's head to help transform Germany into its modern form. Germany would still have done evil things, like murdering huge numbers of Slavs, but the Holocaust was just on a completely different level. It's kind of like Japan in our timeline. The Japanese committed horrible atrocities in World War II, but never did the Holocaust, and so got far lighter. Japan has still not issued an apology for the things it's done in the Second World War, and still thinks of itself as superior to the neighboring nations. The neighboring nations still hate Japan for the things it's done in World War II in a way that has gone away in Europe. The structure of the EU is basically built upon the alliance of France and Germany, and the belief that Germany is a different nation from what it was during World War II. Thus, in a world where the Germans never fully changed, the EU could not exist. Instead, Europe would be split into different regions with different trading and political alliances within the continent, based mainly off geography and culture. The United States would mediate between the different blocs and nations within the continent. People often forget the mass movements of peoples that took place after World War II. After the end of World War II, Stalin wanted to move the border of the Soviet Union west in order to forestall a future invasion. To do this would involve annexing ethnically Polish lands. Since Poland was on the side of the Allies, it would be unacceptable from an international perspective. Thus, to compensate, millions of Germans were moved from what was Eastern Germany and now Western Poland into what is now Germany. This would likely not happen without the Holocaust. Forcibly moving millions of people seems justified when that people has just killed 6.7 million Jews. However, it seems cruel and unnecessary if this is not the case. In this timeline, Germans are moved out of East Prussia, since it sort of was an island of Germans surrounded by Slavs, but not Western Poland, as we would know it in our timeline. Instead, Stalin simply annexes Eastern Poland and says screw you to the rest of the world. This would make the Soviet Union a global pariah, but that's not really anything out of the ordinary in the late 40s. Meanwhile, the state of Israel would not exist in this timeline, with Madagascar already existing as a Jewish one. Palestine would likely exist briefly as an independent nation in this timeline. I say briefly because the great tragedy of the Levant is that it's stuck in between the two powerhouses of the Islamic world, Syria and Egypt, and itself being very lightly settled. Throughout history, when the Levant wasn't controlled by a very distant overlord, it was either controlled by a Syrian or Egyptian faction, with both Syria and Egypt being pan-Arabic nations trying to unite the Arab world, and without their egos being destroyed by the Arab-Israeli war, we would likely have seen the region become a battleground between the two nations. Without America's bridges being burned by being an ally of Israel in the Arab world, we would likely have seen the Russians and the Americans turning this war between Egypt and Syria into a proxy war between the two nations, as the Americans and the Russians would back different factions. Even without the Arab-Israeli war antagonizing relations with Jews and Islamic nations, there'd still be a large movement of Jews from Islamic nations to a Jewish majority nation, and Jews and Islamic nations would still be oppressed. In our timeline, in the 20th century, many Islamic nations went through an intolerant phase, and this would still happen even without Israel, as mainly caused by long-standing reasons that this timeline would not change. I mean, let's look at the intolerance Christians face in the Islamic nations in our timeline. With better agricultural techniques and medicine, the native population of Madagascar would skyrocket in the middle and late 20th century in this timeline. We saw this in Madagascar in our timeline, where the population went from 4 million at the end of World War II to 22 million at the present, and in every third world nation in our timeline. The Jews, meanwhile, having first or second world standards on family size, would be unable to keep up population growth. This would over time turn Madagascar from a majority to a minority Jewish nation. The Jews, to maintain political power, be forced to create an apartheid or segregated state in which the Malagasys would have few political rights. This would make them a global pariah, and to get allies they would ally with Apartheid South Africa, the other global pariah of a similar nature. This support from another economically powerful nation would likely lead to the Apartheid South Africa surviving longer, although how long I can't tell you. What a Feltist! Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that timeline, please comment or subscribe. And please stay tuned to our next video, which will finally be What If Islam Never Existed?